So thank you for 3 really outstanding talks. And now we'll go to some questions. I'd like to ask the speakers to please unmute and turn on your videos at this time. Okay, so first for Pamela, we have a general question about whether the codes in the special interest databases are linked to Food Data Central codes or to Fndds codes.
Yes, right now we're available. We've linked them to NDB codes and SR legacy, though we can in the future expand those to include FDC ID codes as well as Fndds. We haven't done it yet.
Great, thank you. And then we have some specific questions on special interest databases. On iodine, this is a long question, so I'm going to kind of summarize it. The questioner used the iodine database, yay, for a portion of her dissertation to estimate dietary intakes of pregnant women, and had some participants with really high intakes and found that they had high intakes of milk. And the questioner wonders whether the iodine intakes were due to their milk intake, and do you think that milk drinkers are consuming excessive iodine?
I don't know that you can say that, and I think it's especially important, as I've said since I began my career, that you not just look at a single number for intake, but rather you consider the range of possible intakes. And this also depends on how much milk you're drinking. What else are you consuming in your diet that may be iodine containing? Are you taking prenatal vitamins that are iodine containing? It's a very complex picture I think you have to consider. It's not a simple answer.
Not a simple answer. And on the topic of iodine in dairy, here's another question. If the dairy industry moves away from using iodophore based heat dips, how might that affect the concentration of iodine in dairy foods and therefore the ability of the US population to meet iodine needs? And so much of our intake does come from dairy.
Well, it's interesting. When we started this project, 6 or 7 years ago, and the general sort of rumor batted around was that we don't use those cleansing agents anymore. But I consulted the people in our bovine unit on whether or not this was still a practice. And at that time, it was felt that yes, there are still plenty of dairy farmers that are using those cleansing agents. And it also depends on how much iodine is in the feed. And a lot of dairy farmers do supplement the feed they give the cows. So again, it's an evolving landscape, but I would say at this point, you really just have to consider the variability of the nutrient going forward.
Great. Then we have a question that I think is intended for Kellie. Kellie's not feeling well, and I volunteered to answer this question. Thank you for being here.
Sorry, I just started antibiotics like an hour ago. So I took them at lunch and I was like, oh, I'm not feeling so great. So go ahead with the question, Judy, and we can tag team the answer.
Okay. So the question is it possible to pinpoint the parts of the country where soils and products are most likely to have high levels of arsenic in them? Regarding soil, the USGS is probably the best source of that information. Regarding foods, I'm going to put in a plug for the Total Diet study that Kellie mentioned in her talk. I work on the Total Diet study, and we have other attendees here who work on the Total Diet study: Ali Gavlik, Dana Hoffman-Panizzi, Sarah Winfield. We have a poster on using TDS-based data, and we all also work on Closer to Zero. Regarding arsenic, the Total Diet study does test for total arsenic. We have regional data. We will be releasing the data from 2018 to 20 pretty soon. We hope very soon. And that will answer some of the questions about regional variability. I do want to note that most of the data we have on arsenic is for total arsenic, not the inorganic arsenic that's the more risky version of arsenic, although we do have some data on inorganic arsenic in our database. So now I'm going to go to some questions.
Oh, wait a minute, can I add to that?
Oh, sure, of course.
Yeah. So on April 27th, USDA had our first public meeting for Closer to Zero that was covered on agricultural commodities and really looking into the agricultural research and how can we better understand what we know and don't know about what is in the soils and the water and the air where our crops are being grown, and how we can then take actions to be able to mitigate that at the agricultural level. And there were some really interesting graphics that were shown. USDA does have those data. They are available, and they were able to show us maps of the United States with soil levels of different heavy metals and metalloids across the United States. That being said, it's not that simple because the way plants are grown using soil and water and air differ by crop. And so you have crops that are root vegetables like carrots and sweet potatoes, which are grown very, very differently from like apple trees. And so it's not really black and white, but it was really, really interesting. And there's a lot of science that we're looking at about how the amount of nutrients that are in the soil affect the uptake of these heavy metals and metalloids and how they interact, and how it affects plant health, not just how the composition of the plants are affecting human health, but USDA is studying also, and a lot of researchers in the US and internationally, how the presence of these elements also affect the plant's health as well. And when certain elements get too high in the growing environment, the plants don't grow. So it's also toxic to them in many ways. So there is some really good information. It was really exciting to see that. And they said that if we have questions about wanting to see that visualization, that they can do that pretty easily with their databases. So
great, thanks, Kelly. Thank you. This may be a question for Carrie, or it may be a question for Pamela. What is the estimated accuracy of the flavonoid data? Research has shown that the standard deviation of flavonoids in foods is approximately 200%, varying highly with environmental conditions. Not sure which of you wants to take that.
I think either of us could, but I guess a brief answer. I don't have accuracy as it pertains exactly to our database. I definitely would readily admit, though, that there are effects due to handling and processing all along the way, preparation, those types of things. So I would admit that these are, I think someone else asked a similar question, and these indeed are estimates, sort of working to the best of our ability with what we have.
Great.
And I would add on to Carrie, I agree with you. When we did a study many, many years ago, we analyzed flavonoids in a number of fruits and vegetables, and they were all over the place. So we know that the variability is extremely high. That said, you have to have working numbers. So the research may be different from what you have to put in a database for epidemiological purposes, but I agree with you, Carrie.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question on flavonoids. Does decaffeinated green or black tea have the same amount of flavonoids? I'm assuming that means as caffeinated, the caffeinated versions.
I think there is some
process.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. Just wondering if the process of decaffeination affects the content of flavonoids.
I was trying to quickly look up within the database, but
okay.
I believe, if I remember correctly, I think there is there's some effect due to the additional processing. I'd have to get back to you with specific values. So.
Okay, great. There were some questions about how can people find the nitrate values or the glucosinolate values, and Pamela answered those, but I just thought for general reference that we ought to mention that those are works in progress and
The glucosinolate finder is actually out there. It's not on the MAFCL website. It's if you go to Food Data Central and look under experimental foods, it's there. The other three databases I spoke of, nitrates, nitrites, purines, those will be, I hope, released by the end of this calendar year. The iodine is already up.
great. And there were a couple of questions about oxalates. I don't know, Pamela, if you want to just.
Yeah,
For
we've talked
very
about
general interest.
oxalates and phytates and other compounds. We need to get through these four major ones first, and then we'll start looking at the next ones. But they're important, yes.
Totally makes sense. I just have one question, and that's about flavonoids. What are the prospects for doing additional analyses of flavonoids?
Additional analyses in terms of
Just updating the database.
I'm not sure about myself. That might be, I guess, maybe more in Pamela's purview.
Well, I know that we analyze foods, foundation foods, to populate Food Data Central, and certainly those are on the list of nutrients to be considered. It's probably something that FSRG and MAFCL should talk about together to develop new data.
Okay, great. Just curious. I think that's it for questions. And I just want to thank the speakers again for 3 really wonderful talks. And we will regroup. We have a health break now, and we'll regroup and meet again at 3:05 for the next session.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.